I warmly welcome you to today's webinar. Today, as you can clearly see here, the topic that we will be discussing is deadlines and reminders. We are now in the 6th part of our Fundamentals in timeSensor Legal webinar series. My name is Zoe Schiewek. I am responsible account manager for the German-speaking region timeSensor AG, includes German-speaking Switzerland and Germany. Today we will just be focusing on deadlines and reminders. First, in the initial point of the agenda, we will now look at how to create and manage them. Then we will see how to set up a recurring deadline, or in some cases, a recurring reminder. After that, we will look at all the places in the software where you can view the deadlines and reminders you have created. I don't want to waste any time, so I'll hide my presentation and will return to timeSensor Legal 365. As we can see at the top, I am logged in as Miss Monika Muster. Miss Monika Muster is one of the partners at our firm Muster Ensemble, so she has administrative rights and is therefore not restricted in her use of the software. The Deadlines and Reminders tool is, in fact, a standalone add-in module designed specifically to function independently. You need to have subscribed to this in timeSensor Legal 365 in order to use this button here. You can find it in the personal area of the case handlers. As we've seen in previous webinars, the personal area of the case handlers can be easily accessed by selecting it in the area bar at the top left. I click on Miss Monika Muster and then select the button for Deadlines and Reminders. As we can see, the Deadlines and Reminders tool opens. At the top left, we can see that these are assigned to Miss Muster. We will go through this interface together and examine its functionalities. Up here, we see a small arrow. Here, we have the option to view deadlines and reminders for all users. The following is important. We are logged in as Miss Monika Muster as the administrator of the timeSensor Legal 365 software. This means we have access to all the software's functionalities. We are not restricted. You may not have all permissions in the software, and the view here may be slightly different depending on your permissions. This means in some cases you may see your own name here. That's not a problem. It simply means that you can only view deadlines that are linked to you, that you are involved with, or that are assigned to your name as the responsible person. In our case, however, we actually want to view the data in its entirety. We set the selection to all users, and we can view all deadlines and reminders for the month of May 2025 across all users of the software. Up here, we can also select categories from here. We'll take a closer look at that in a moment. For deadlines and reminders, there are separate categories which you can define and configure yourself for your law firm. You'll see exactly how that works in just a moment. First, let's scroll down a little bit further. Here we can see individual deadlines or reminders. In the first column, we see for which client or mandate we have created this deadline or reminder, allowing us to easily identify the associated party for each entry. In the row below, we can see what it is about, specifically what the subject or reason for this deadline or reminder is, giving us a clear understanding of its purpose and context. The color coding works like a traffic light, green, yellow, and red. Here we see a small green check mark. If I open the deadline, we can see it is a completed deadline. We will take a closer look at this window in a moment. Traffic light system. We can see that completed items are marked with a green check mark. And then there are two other symbols. One is a circle, a small dot, and then we also have a little flag here. The difference is that the red dot, a dot in general, as we see it here in yellow, at the bottom represents a deadline. And here, when I open the record, we can see at the top that this is a reminder. We have dots and flags, deadlines and reminders. These are displayed in the form of a traffic light system, which for us means that if the dot is read red on a traffic light means stop, don't gossen, it is truly an urgent matter. This is meant to draw my attention. For deadlines, red means that they are very, very close to the current date, or perhaps even already in the past. We see this in this example. We have the current date. This is a deadline that we apparently missed. That's why it is marked in red. Here we have a deadline that concerns next week. The deadline for next week is already yellow. In contrast, you can see up here with the follow-up reminder that the flag is still green, even though the reminder date is before the deadline we just looked at. We assume that deadlines need to be handled a bit more urgently, since they often involve court or official deadlines. For this reason, this item will turn yellow earlier, prompting you to meet the deadline and complete the necessary tasks before it expires. Now, let's scroll a bit further down in our view. Here on the left, we see a small, subtle plus button. We can set a new deadline or follow-up. Of course, we can also use the minus button next to it to delete a selected deadline or follow-up reminder. At the bottom, we see a red notification indicating that there's still an outstanding deadline from previous months. This is relevant for us because it shows that timeSensor Legal 365 alerts us to any pending deadlines and follow-up reminders. If I navigate 1 month back in the timeline overview to April 2025, I can see that it must be this deadline, or in this case, this reminder. If I open it, I can also see that it has not been completed. If I want to mark it as completed, I can do so at the bottom of the screen simply by checking the completed checkbox. Next to it, we can also clearly see that it records who completed the deadline and when it was marked as completed. Now I navigate back to May and we see this notification has disappeared. I can hide or show completed items with the corresponding checkbox. This is similar to our ticket system, where it works in much the same way. Furthermore, I have the possibility to display only deadlines if I wish, or in this case, only reminders. Of course, when I select a deadline or a reminder, for example, I can access additional tools. I have the option to print a list of deadlines, deadline details, or a mandate deadline list by selecting the print button. You can or must create these lists yourself in your system. The entire system here is extremely user-friendly and can be individually configured. You can customize and tailor this to your office standards exactly as you wish in the way that best suits your specific needs, processes, and workflow. If we look at the familiar action menu at the bottom, I would like to emphasize once again that you need to select a data record before performing this action. Nothing will happen without a selection. The button does respond, but as we can see, it doesn't know what to respond to. If I click on it with a selection, I get the following menu. I can open mandate file, dossier, duplicate a deadline. We'll take a closer look at what this is all about in a moment. I can postpone the deadline. Let's click on it to see what happens. I can initiate a postponement for this deadline if needed. Or, for example, extend a deadline. We get the same menu. We can, if we wish, display the associated address or alternatively the associated mandate. I'd like to demonstrate this using this mandate. We can see which address and which mandate it is. In this case, for example, it's the mandate labor law. Now we're already in June. Let's navigate back to May once more and take a look at how to enter a deadline. As previously described, I click on the plus symbol at the bottom, the small plus button, and then I can specify in the top left whether it's a deadline or a follow-up reminder. Here I switch between the views. You can observe the screen changes. You can see that when I go ahead and make a selection of a deadline, a small icon will appear right here, and it will say either deadline or follow-up, depending on which option you have selected at that moment. For our case, we want to create a deadline, so I will leave this selection as it is, and then we'll move further to the right, where we can specify what this deadline should be called. This field directly refers to the entry down below, where we have submission of credit balance, specifically allowing us to specify what our submission deadline is about. There's also the option to conveniently store suggested values for this particular field. Here I have entered both expert opinion and objection as suggested values, which means that if I simply click on this small toggle, I have the option to quickly and easily insert my suggested values directly into the field whenever needed. However, I can also enter free text and, for example, type in our deadline. We want to create a deadline as an example so that we can find it again. Let's call it our deadline, and we can further elaborate and define our deadline in the column below. For example, you can specify exactly when this deadline starts or when it eventually expires. We can always do this manually if needed, if you wish. I'll close this again. Or alternatively, with the deadline calculator tool, which you can easily find online, this deadline calculator assists us in calculating a deadline, usually for statutory deadlines. I am currently working here in a Swiss database. So we are operating under Swiss regulations, under Swiss law. This is the basis for the calculation. So when we calculate a deadline, it is based on the law applicable in Switzerland. For our German customers, German law is applied as the basis. If you have a German database, meaning you are customer based in Germany, then German law will be applied here. In that case, the fields will look different. We can update the information here, but for now we are showing the version you see. We operate in different countries and adapt our software to local requirements of our clients. Up here, we can specify the event date. There is also a small calendar function for this. Let's say the event date is June 13th of this year. Now we can add further parameters here. We have the option to simply store standard deadlines for our law firm. If there are deadlines that frequently or very frequently occur in a particular area of law, it makes sense to save these as standard deadlines. Then I don't have to recalculate and configure the deadline every single time. It's enough to simply select a saved standard deadline. I've just shown how to do that. I'm happy to show it again. In the deadline calculator, I go to the action menu located right next to the add selection and choose Edit Standard Deadlines. Here at the bottom, using these tools, the plus and the trash can icon, I can easily add or delete standard deadlines. We can specify when the deadline begins, on the day following the event, or on the event day itself. Our deadline is June 13, 2025. That's even a particularly ominous Friday the 13th, always such a truly great date for a deadline. So we definitely won't miss this one. Down here we can set the deadline expiry. We can specify whether Saturdays, Sundays, and public holidays are excluded from the calculation. We can select or exclude an underlying legal regulation here as appropriate. We can specify whether it is a statutory deadline or not. Down here you'll find a small disclaimer from timeSensor AG. I'd like to point out here that without activating this checkbox, you cannot have this deadline suggested by timeSensor Legal 365. In any case, you must always double check yourself whether this deadline has actually been recorded correctly. We do not take any responsibility for the tool calculating correct deadlines based on potentially incorrect information. You should always use the 4 eyes principle to carefully check whether this deadline has actually been recorded correctly and accurately. The responsibility for this lies with your law firm. I click on Suggest Deadline, and almost instantly, as you can see, the deadline appears right up here. We will now close the deadline calculator and continue navigating in this window. We have now successfully calculated the deadline date. We could now set the deadline to expire at 12 noon instead of 5 p.m. This means that the deadline will end at 12 o'clock. In this case, that would be the event day, or specifically the 14th, since we have excluded Sundays, public holidays, and Saturdays. Our event will then take place at 12 o'clock. Now, in the subject of this deadline, we can also specify the responsible party for the deadline. To do this, we can either fill in the field manually, simply by typing, or use the selection option via the appropriate action menu. We already know this from the timesheet, so it is familiar to us. Here I can search either by mandate name, by client and mandate, by client or by mandate manager. It's entirely up to you. Personally, I prefer the selector window because it allows me to search throughout the entire software using the address categories I am familiar with. So here I have the option to search for specific clients and don't have to scroll through the entire list. I find that very convenient. I can simply drag and drop the address and the mandate into the corresponding field, making it very easy to integrate them into the deadline. Now we can see that the deadline is for Miss Regia. This deadline is called Our Deadline, so we can easily find it again. And now we could assign this deadline to a category. The categories work similarly to what I mentioned earlier with the suggested values in the upper field, that is in the designation of the deadline. Here as well, for example, we can configure or set up suggested values so that we don't always have to manually fill in the free text field. Here, for example, we can specify that in this case it is an initial consultation or a court date. We could also create temporary appointments or regular meetings. This is entirely up to you and your administrative staff, of course. You can simply decide for yourself how you want to set this up. Select a regular meeting, choose a fix. We'll see why in a moment as we continue to scroll down. Here we see that this is a deadline. Here we have the option to set who this deadline should apply to. We can do this using a selection on the left in this menu. We can select individual people here as we wish. We can also select just one person. However, the deadline must be assigned to at least one person. There is no upper limit to this. Here we have the option to select multiple people at once based on the caseworker group to which they belong. If I want to create a deadline for all partners and click on Partner, then as we can see, partners are immediately selected on the left side. Now we come to a very important point when creating and setting up a deadline. As a rule, I want to be reminded of a deadline. Here I have the option to generate a warning. A warning in this case means that while I'm working in timeSensor level 365, a small window will pop up on my screen, providing information about a deadline I have created or about a deadline created by someone else that has been assigned to me. I will be notified of this on my screen when the warning is triggered. If that is not sufficient for me, I can configure the system to send a ticket to remind me of the deadline. We have already become familiar with the ticket system. Up here on the top left, I will then receive a ticket, which contains the same information that I have entered here. Down here, we also have a detail field so that we can add further information about this deadline. Alternatively, for deadlines not for reminders, but only for actual deadlines, we can also view the history down here. You can configure and manage this as you wish if needed. We can also simply store suggested values in the details section. The principle should be familiar to you at this point. For example, I have a suggestion here that a client has called. Of course, that doesn't match our selection of the regular meeting above, but I can simply delete it again. In this case, for example, I could choose to select all of the partners and then leave a detailed note right here, asking that one of the partners please get in touch with a potential new client as soon as possible, if possible. We'll delete that again and confirm this deadline. So I do that using the button up here. It's very important that you always confirm at this point, otherwise nothing will be saved. And now we have created this deadline. We can see that this deadline still has a small blue question mark. At the very bottom of the screen, we have the completed button as well as the checked checkbox, both of which are clearly visible here. This deadline has not yet been checked. Since the highest possible level of precision is required here, we use a verification mechanism, a process that must always be carried out by other caseworkers or employees. For the sake of accuracy, I, as Monika Muster, personally created this deadline myself. If I now try to check it myself, I will be warned that this is not possible because I created it myself. At this point, another user would need to log in and check this deadline. Let's take a look at what that looks like. Here, for example, we have follow-up reminders. Here we have a deadline which in fact has already been completed. But similar to what typically happens when the completed checkbox is actually activated, as you can see, we can quite clearly see that it was in fact our colleague Mr. Cesarini himself who checked this particular deadline. We'll simply close this now and navigate back to our deadline. We now know how to create a deadline. The process is the same when creating a follow-up reminder, except that you select follow-up instead of deadline. Next, we want to take a look at step-by-step how to create a recurring deadline in this process. You might already be familiar with this concept from other programs. It's also known from Teams, from the calendar function. There you have the option to create recurring appointments. We can do the same in timeSensor Legal 365. We do this by first simply creating a deadline or a follow-up notification or reminder, just as we have just seen. Then we select it and choose the duplicate deadline option in the action menu at the bottom right. If I select this, I am taken to the following screen where I can specify exactly what kind of appointment or repetition rate it should be. For example, I could select a monthly appointment here. This should take place on the 14th day of every first month. I could also have this deadline repeat on the last Friday of every third month, which means it would occur quarterly, such as in March, June, September, and December. And I can limit this repeating interval to a period of 12 months, so the deadline does not continue indefinitely. Alternatively, I could enter this information in years instead of months, which would be another way to make the same selection. Limit deadline to 1 year. Down here, I could also specifically indicate whether I want to exclude Sundays and public holidays or not, if that's what I prefer. We'll leave it as is, select No, and confirm. After that, as you can see, we can see that as we continue to navigate right here on the screen, this linear deadline has now been duplicated and we've created a recurring event. That's just all for deadlines and reminders. The last item on our agenda is that we just want to take a look at where in the software we can view deadlines and reminders. I'd like to show you that as well. We're already familiar with the action menu, and from there we have the option to open the dossier. Let's open the dossier here, and we see up here, for example, with Miss Regia, we see a callback, a reminder that we entered. Let's check what other outstanding deadlines we currently have in the software. For example, here there's also a court date. That's also actually a deadline in this case. We can see that by the indicator. Additionally, we could also open the client file and see that we can view the court date there as well. We are able to easily view the deadline as it is shown in the dossier. We have it up there. There too, we can hide completed items and so on. There are several different options here that we have available in the window for configuring deadlines and reminders. Here too, we could edit the data, and as just shown, this also works in the client file. Same options both. Here in this section, we can carefully select exactly which specific category it is, and also choose from which particular users we want to see and view the corresponding deadlines. The webinar is now officially over. I hope you now know how to use deadlines and reminders in timeSensor Legal 365. If not, you will find a helpful link to further documentation and additional resources provided below. There you will find screenshots and the principle is explained in writing. You can also easily find this information if you need to on our website. Thank you very much for participating in today's session and goodbye.